I basically knew only violence. In 1972, as a 5-year-old child, I was injured in a no warning IRA car bomb. And as our school bus was coming down past the Ardoyne, Republicans and Nationalists had formed a gauntlet and basically petrol-bombed the school bus. Getting off the bus, and my school blazer was on fire, and we were patting the flames out. And I can remember looking back up the road at what was now a full-scale riot taking place. It's the first time that I remember seething hatred in me. And yeah, I looked up that road and went, I'm gonna fucking kill yous. I'm gonna kill yous. And 3 years later, 3 years later, I was in the army. Taught they're a target. They're not a human. They are completely dehumanized. They're the enemy. They're the terrorists, whatever you want to call them. And your job is to put rounds into them, aimed rounds, until they cease to be a threat.
Very good. Glenn, thank you very much for sitting down and joining. We appreciate you taking the time. A lot of my guests kind of came of age. My Northern Ireland guests, they kind of came of age as the Troubles were beginning, so kind of late 60s. A lot of them were like kind of in their teens or their late teens by then. For you, you kind of grew up with it happening. I believe you were born 1967.
Yeah.
You might give us an idea there of what your area was like growing up, and indeed where it was to fill us in.
I was born in 32 Ainsworth Drive, which is a working class, 2 up, 2 down terrace house in the Loyalist Woodvale area of West Belfast. The home had no hot running water. Our toilet was outside. We had no bathroom or anything like that. The bathroom, or the bath, should I say, was a tin bath that was hung on the outside whitewashed yard wall. And every Friday evening, myself and other members of the family would have got bathed before the weekend, so to speak, starting. And then I was also, as a child, bathed on the Sunday night before going to school. My home, I was raised by my grandparents until the age of 12, and that's their house that I'm describing. It was a, how could you put it, a heartly home. I have 32 first cousins, and my grandparents' home, 32 Ainsworth Drive, was the hub of our family. Our family would have been of the loyal Irish tradition. What do I mean by loyal Irish? I mean that they would have looked eastwards for their sovereignty. They looked to Britain. They very much believed in the union that was comprised of Irishmen, Scotsmen, Welshmen, and Englishmen, and that combined made up the British nation. But it was also very much socialist in overture. My granda had worked all his days in the brickworks of Belfast, both McGladdery's and Parkview, where he was the shop steward. So trade unionism, there was the influence of trade unionism, that sort of, in the terms of United Kingdom, that post-war Labour type attitude. There wasn't much talk about Queen and Country and that type of stuff. It was more that we were simply the loyal Irish. We were the British contingent that made up the nation that is the United Kingdom. And their view was that Irish Republicans, Irish nationalism, were disloyal and therefore the rebels. And that would have been talked openly in the House. And obviously, being born in 1967, I wasn't part of the Orange State. I wasn't part of any of the prejudice that had taken place or the discrimination that had taken place since partition. But I was very much born on that cusp of civil uprising, where a sizable section of society were looking at the Northern Ireland state and saying, we have had enough, and we are going to overthrow your state. So living where I lived in Ainsworth Drive, the peace wall, or what is now known as the peace wall, I call them war walls, but the peace wall You know, when I was born, it didn't exist. But then when the communities built the barricades and the army then occupied those barricades and built them higher and higher, you know, was 100 meters away. So I literally grew up with violence every day occurring in our street. And being where I was from, you know, as far as we were concerned, you know, the RUC had let us down. The army wasn't protecting us. And every day we as a community were being put upon by armed action and armed assaults by the IRA and the provisional IRA, obviously from 1970 onwards. So there was very much that our suffering was caused by violent Irish republicanism. And well, indeed, until the ceasefires, I grew up and I basically knew only violence, you know, and in 1972, as a 5-year-old child, I was injured in a no warning IRA car bomb. You know, and so I went from being a child victim of the IRA to, as I know we're going to cover, joining the army to be, you know, and getting involved in it. So, yeah, that's the time. I was this working class, Hartley home that was very much loyal Irish and left-leaning Labour Party type socialism and principles.
God, I might ask you there about the time you were injured as a child. Do you recall like the circumstances and how close and stuff?
Oh yeah. Where we lived, there was a bar at the top of the street on the corner of the Woodvale Road. The bar was called the Woodvale Arms. We called it Cornets after the family that owned it, but the bar's actual name was the Woodvale Arms. And I was a member of Woodvale Methodist Church, and we were going away. It was a Saturday morning, and we were going away on a Sunday school trip. And I was up early, obviously, because we were going away on a trip. And I was walking over to the church. Now, to put that into perspective, the church is probably 250 meters from my house, you know, so as a 5-year-old walking up and going over was quite, you know, it was normal. And the IRA detonated a no warning car bomb at 8:15 in the morning. Their excuse was that they were trying to kill Loyalist paramilitaries, but, you know, doesn't really wash. I was literally crossing the road as the bomb detonated behind me. So the shockwave picked me up, threw me across the road. There's a bar, there was 2 bars in each corner. So I actually was flung against the steps of the bar diagonally across the road from it, called the Mountain View. And I received head injuries like this. It's not so noticeable now as I've got grey and much older, but if you look at photographs of me when I was young, you can very much see a distinguished scar going through my right eyebrow and down the side of my face. So I was injured. But as things were back then, you know, I was one, I think in that car bomb, there was 48 Protestants injured. And they basically, you know, you get conveyed to hospital, you got stitched up and you got turfed out. Like, I mean, that was a Saturday morning. And I can recall going back into school on the Tuesday morning and not wanting to, you know, because I was trying to swing the lead because of the injury and play up on it and get a few days off school. So that's why it sticks in my head. So, you know, that's what people, you know, you got to remember that violence was happening day and daily. You know, where I live, and I'm including in nationalist and Catholic communities, you know, if you put a compass point on Lanark Way, what is now Lanark Way, and the gates at Lanark Way, and you widen your compass out for 2 miles and draw a radii, 48% of the casualties in the conflict occurred within that radii. So it's safe to state that while everybody was affected by the conflict, and by affected I mean some could be a simple thing like inconvenienced at a road checkpoint, there are others who were living the conflict day and daily. You know, it's not by any accident that West and North Belfast has got the highest usage of antidepressants in the whole of the United Kingdom. You know, and there's a reason for that, you know. So that's what happened that day when I myself was injured. But the same bar was actually bombed on 3 further occasions by the provost, and on each occasion the bombs just got bigger. And there was one, I think it was 73. A historian can check it and correct me if I'm wrong, but where literally the houses in the surrounding area had their roofs entirely blown off, and the windows all came in, the glass and so on and so forth. And you know, it isn't like nowadays where there's support agencies that would go into something like that and consider it a disaster. You know, so I can remember the housing executive of the day coming out and putting tarpaulin on the roof, and we lived like that for probably about 6 months until it was repaired. And not and again, I'm emphasizing that, you know, I'm talking of my lived experience. Obviously, every house in the street was like that. You know, there were people across our society on both sides of the divide that were suffering under armed action as much as we were. But for me, as a kid growing up, it was the IRA who were responsible for the suffering, solely responsible for the suffering in my community.
If I had asked like 5-year-old Glenn, who was, I don't know, a month removed or a couple of months removed from being injured, thank God it wasn't worse, but being injured in that bomb, like if I had asked you to explain maybe like what was going on in terms of conflict and why someone would want to blow up a bomb in your ear, what do you think you would have told me, like your grasp of it?
Young me, 5-year-old me.
5-year-old
the 5-year-old me would have said the Fenians are trying to kill us and drive us into the sea. That's
really
simple. Yeah, it was that brutally sectarian. You know, there was armed action taking place daily. There was lawlessness all around us. The police, as in the RUC, the army, after coming in 69, you know, our community viewed that they had failed us. The only people that we at that time saw as our saviors was the 1st Battalion of the UVF. You know, and that's how I thought then, you know, and I witnessed it with my own eyes. It's my lived experience. And nobody will ever, you know, change my mind of that lived experience, because you know, it's my truth. It may be different to somebody born 400 meters from me that lived on the Catholic side of the divide, but that's the reality of what I was living day and daily. It's the communal language that we used. You know, the term Brits out was used heavily at that time. We were the British presence in Ireland. So for us, and as far as we were concerned, yes, we were Irish, but we were also British. So when people were yelling Brits out and this, that, and the other, it was very much about they are trying to kill us and they're trying to drive us into the sea so that we go to England. And that was instilled in me from a very, very early age, that this conflict was about them trying to drive us into the sea and out of Ireland.
How realistic of a possibility, like through the 70s and 80s, how realistic of a possibility in your mind was it that the 6 counties would rejoin the Republic and that ye would be left as a Protestant minority in a country that you didn't belong to before?
Those nuances really didn't occur in my mind until I was a teenager, being truthful. You know, the violence consumed everything up to a teenager point, and it was only really as a teenager, as your worldview's changing, that you start considering, you know, what is it they're actually fighting for? What is it they want? What is it that they're trying to achieve? And obviously, post the hunger strikes of 1981 and Sinn Féin politically coming onto the scene big time, there was more of a, how could you put it, political talk. You know, it changed from being this revolutionary statements of Brits out, we want to drive these people into the sea. You know, let's face it, in the 70s, the IRA's war aim was to, you know, get rid of the Brits, get rid of the prods, and then declare war on Dáil Éireann and unite Ireland. You know, that was their aim. And by 81, certainly they realized that was never going to happen in the way that they were fighting it. So the language changed from 81 onwards, post the Sinn Féin's real entry into politics. And but the unification of Ireland was not a consideration for me as a child. I grew up in a household where my grandparents would have been very vocal about two things. One was the Home Rule movement of the era when they were children, because they very much saw that partition was wrong, and they would have openly discussed how partition was wrong in their views. But by the same token, they also looked at what they viewed as the Catholic Free State and what had occurred down there, i.e. the reprisals, the pogroms against Protestants post-partition. They then looked, aghast at the Irish Civil War, where, and so they would cite that whole period as real fears about why they could never join the Free State and be safe, so to speak, in a united Ireland. And those fears still prevail to this day amongst the many in the Protestant and Unionist community, but they were originally drawn up and based on a reality of what happened historically. The other thing I would say is that, and I have said this in other talks, people often zero in Northern Ireland post-partition. They often talk about, Craig's speech, a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people, so on and so forth. But very little people talk about the Catholic state that the Free State and later the Irish Republic was. It was dominated by church influence. So as I talk about partition, because I do recognize that partition was wrong, but it created, in my mind, partition created two bastard states in this island. The North was all about marching rights and the dominance of the Orange Order. The South was all about religious rights and the domination of the Catholic Church and state. And that's just the way that we saw it. So for my grandparents, for my parents, that was their alienation against any concept of unification.
Okay. So you touched on it there briefly, but you said that like you didn't have much faith in the RUC in terms of their ability and their interest in keeping you safe. I know that at the time, I probably like many Catholics would have felt that the RUC was like actively against them and not on their side. Did it feel like that to you, or was it just the case that they didn't have like the competency and care enough about kind of working class people like you?
It depends what way you were looking at it. When I make that statement, we had an RUC family, as for want of a better description, that lived across the road from us, that were as working class as I was. And the father was in the RUC, had grown up, but this is in the days of community policing and in the old style of community policing. When I say the RUC failed, I mean that they were simply overwhelmed. There was complete lawlessness in our streets, and the RUC couldn't hold the line. Soldiers were then put in that, quite frankly, didn't have a notion about the history of Ireland, the why, what, for of the intimacy of our streets in Belfast in particular. And they made huge mistakes. Like I can remember being in the Mayfair bakery, which was a bakery shop on the Woodvale Road with my grandmother, and a member of what I now know to be the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, grabbing my grandmother by the hair and dragging her out because there was an incident going on outside and they were wanting to clear the thing, and that stuck with me, has stuck with me all my days. So the RUC were overwhelmed. And you also got to remember that the RUC of them was that old style RUC that, you know, it didn't take prisoners, so is the terminology I use, you know. So as kids growing up who would have later went down to riot or cause mischief on the peace line or do things, you know, back then, you know, I felt an RUC man's truncheon as a teenager, in particular, in the sense that that's how they dealt with things then. You know, it was entirely inappropriate, of course, as we look with our modern eyes and human rights and things and how the world has advanced. But back then it was just par for course that you got a clip around the ear from the local, you know, RUC sergeant, and you get told the ways up.
So I see. Given that you would later end up joining them, how did you view these British soldiers that were in your streets? Pretty much,
It depended on the regiment. It
all...
actually depended on the regiment that was there. So, for example, an early memory would be 3-Par, the Parachute Regiment, were stationed in Leopold Street Barracks, and we all thought the Pars were brilliant. You know, as kids, as Protestant kids growing up, they took you for rides in their jeeps. You know, they let you look down the sights of their weapons. So we all thought the Pars were great. The ones that I always sticks in my mind was some of the Scottish regiments and some of the Welsh regiments of the day, who just really didn't have a notion about us as the loyal Irish. Didn't have a notion really about anybody on the rebel side, and were just clueless, to be quite honest, to the scenario and the situation of what was going around them. In some of the cases, particularly with, again, certain Scottish regiments, they could be quite sectarian. And by sectarian, I mean as in they would be pro-Catholic and would have been anti-Protestant and would have let that be known to us as young Protestants in the Woodvale area. So it really depended on the regiment. But within our family, there was a tradition of joining the British Army that goes back probably to the 16th century, if I look. But certainly, you know, I've great grandparents that were in the army. You know, my grandmother's father was killed at the Somme. You know, and we have had a history. You know, my cousins, my older cousins, some of them were in the army, and so on and so forth. So, you know, that tradition is of joining the British Army, of being given of service to your notion of nationhood. It would have been very much rife, not just in my family, but across. So I had mixed views about the army before joining them.
Fair enough. You might tell us there. There was a particular incident that probably pushed you further into wanting to take like kind of armed action against the IRA, and that was I believe when your school bus was attacked. If you might give us a background on that and tell us what happened.
Well, obviously violence was occurring day and daily, and unless the violence impacted on you directly, you just cracked on with your life. You know, so for my parents, for my grandparents, they were working class people. They were going out trying to do a day's work, trying to put food on the table. And unless that violence directly impacted you, people just lived their lives. Every night we would watch the Gore Fest on the evening news. You know, the statistics coming in, the violence of elsewhere. But unless it really impacted on you directly, you just cracked on with your life. So in 1981, I was at secondary school. I was attending the Belfast Boys Model. And on the day that Bobby Sands died, the place erupted into civil disobedience. And as our school bus was coming down past the Ardoyne, Republicans and Nationalists had formed a gauntlet and basically petrol-bombed the school bus. And but for the bravery, to be honest, of the bus driver who put boot to accelerator and mounted a roundabout and got us to the relative safety of the upper Woodvale Road. The casualties that day on that bus would have been worse. But I can remember getting off the bus, and my school blazer wasn't far, and we were patting the flames out, and some of us older boys were looking after the first years and getting them sorted. And I can remember looking back up the road at what was now a full-scale riot taking place. And just, it's the first time that I remember seething hatred in me. And yeah, I looked up that road and went, I'm gonna fucking kill yous. I'm gonna kill yous. And 2 years later, 3 years later, I was in the army.
God, yeah, I can understand you thinking that at the time. Did when you say use, in your mind at the time, was the use, was that IRA, Republicans, Catholics? How wide did the net go for you?
As far as I was concerned at that time, I understood that the IRA was a guerrilla army that was waging a war against us, the British people in Ireland, and therefore anybody that supported that army, directly, indirectly, voting Sinn Féin, whatever way. So that covered everybody in a blanket general description of what would be the Irish Republican community.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. In your area. Okay. Just before we'll get on to you joining the army. But in your area, how were like the Loyalist paramilitaries viewed the UVF, UDA? Were they seen as like protecting your community? Was it like a good thing? Was it like a good thing to be in them generally, viewed in your community?
Again, it depends on the family, but certainly from my perspective, as far as I'm concerned, and it's still a historical accurate statement even today, that now that I'm much older, but during those early days of lawlessness and where our streets were unprotected, the volunteers of the UVF 1st Battalion was the only thing stopping Irish Republican hordes and the IRA from coming into our communities and killing us. So we very much viewed them, not obviously as freedom fighters, but as defenders of our community, defenders of our faith. And that's, I would still be how I see that old school UVF today. Now, I get the UVF was waging a campaign, its own bombing campaign and everything else. But if you're talking to me and asking me about those volunteers who stood in the streets and stopped the IRA and Republicans coming into our community, then I have nothing still but admiration for them. And just as they didn't deny me as a child, I certainly won't deny them while their old men are in their graves. And that's how I seen it. But obviously, like any paramilitary organization, there are criminal elements in every paramilitary organization, and that includes the IRA. There are psychopaths in every single army, and that includes the UVF, the IRA, the British Army, no matter who it'll be. So there was always elements that were psychotic, that did awful, terrible things. But in the balance of it, I'm certainly happy to describe those old volunteers as men who, at that time, I would have looked up to, and as would have many of my age group. It's a fact that, certainly at my age, guys leaving school, many of them went into the Loyalist paramilitaries, but they also went into the army and the police. To be truthful, I would say it's probably about equal, it's equal, probably the same amount that joined the Loyalist paramilitaries would have joined the state forces, the army and the police. So
we're not talking about overlap. We're talking about some of them joined paramilitary and some of them joined RUC and army, or you're talking about people. Do you mean people in the RUC and army also being a member of a Loyalist group?
No. I what I'm saying is, if out of a class of 30, if 10 joined something, 5 would have went into the police and army, and 5 would have went into Loyalist paramilitaries. That's what I'm meaning.
Okay, so yeah, what you said about that initial view of like the UVF being a role of like community protection. I remember I remember another guest of mine, Seamus Kearney, who would be from the Falls Road area, kind of St. Matthews. He had a very similar thing. His first contact with the IRA was them as people who stopped a sectarian mob from coming in and burning their houses like it happened
Yeah,
in Bay Street. So yeah, when the government security forces let people hanging like that, it drives them into the arms of these paramilitaries, you know, and of course it gives you a favorable view of them if they're the only ones who you see
yep.
in your community. Yeah, it's understandable.
Yeah, the thing that people need to get into their brains about, that period, 65 through to the emergence of the provisional IRA in the 70s, is the how can I put it, the causes of conflict. People did not wake up one morning and after having taken a tablet the night before and said, I'm suddenly violent. I'm suddenly going to do this. This from partition and before, the causes of conflict were sown in our societies. Indeed, I now would argue they were nurtured by the governments of Westminster, various successive governments. But partition totally put into a living history, for want of a better description, of almost 50 years before the uprising, where people just didn't wake up one morning and say, right, we're going to go down and burn them out, and we're going to go up and burn them out, and we're going to do this. It was simmering historically for decades. If we want to just look at partition as our state, that I don't think we need to go back any further than partition. Although we could, well, I mean, we're going to face it, we could take it right back to 1169. But the reality is that the causes of conflict meant that there was a simmering tensions across society here that weren't being addressed by the how could you put it, the Fur Coat Brigade, that weren't being addressed by abysmal political leadership of the day, and all as it took was for somebody to like the touch paper, and they did.
You might take me through your decision to join the British Army, and on that note, why not go in the direction of a loyalist paramilitary? In my opinion, like back then, I think you can tell me, but I think most people would have seen, like, if you wanted to get back at the IRA, that the paramilitary route was kind of the way to go, because you're not bound by military rules and regulations and stuff,
Well, it depends on the paramilitary. The paramilitaries have command structures as well. But yes, I accept that some organizations on the loyalist side would have been determined reckless. I wouldn't put the UVF in that bracket back then at all. Indeed, the UVF had probably initially stronger military structures than the IRA did. But that's another argument. My uncle was Hughie Smith, who is known as Belfast's longest serving working class Protestant councillor in Belfast City Council. Hugh, along with Gusty Spence, Davy Overend, Jim MacDonald, Jackie Hewitt, others, all were the founders of the Progressive Unionist Party. They'd gone through a couple of guises before that, but basically they became the core of the Progressive Unionist Party way back in 78, 79 when the party was formed. And I grew up in a household where that politic was swarming every day, that left-leaning, as I say, socialist in principle, loyalism. So whenever I got off that school bus in 1981, seething with hatred, I did try to join a loyalist paramilitary. But my uncle ensured that I couldn't. by word of mouth. So I became persona non grata at every door I rapped to try get in. So that was okay. I then, you got to remember these guys were in and out of the house. I was growing up around them. I worked part-time as a bottle boy in some of the Loyalist clubs. And so I knew Gusty, I knew some of these people, and Gusty was an old Ulster rifleman. He had served in the Royal Ulster Rifles. And it was really through his guidance that the army first, as in joining the army when I did, came into being a serious contender for me to get revenge, because that's for me what it was about. I naively thought I could join the army, get the best training possible, come back to Northern Ireland and take the fight to the IRA. That's ultimately, as a 16-year-old wee lad who had never left home, who had grown up entirely in his own community of the Woodvale, who regularly attended his church, Woodvale Methodist, who was schooled and raised in a Protestant state school. That was my naive view. And so, aged 16, I completed all the attestation to join the army. Hid it initially from my parents, and the army being the army, because they just want recruits. So the army were quite happy to take me initially in March of 1984, and I was going to go, but my father cracked up, and he basically put his foot down and said, "You're going nowhere until you complete your O levels," and blah 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 blah. So I did the O levels in June, and I finished them, and then literally within weeks found myself at the gates of Sir John Moore Barracks, Shorncliffe, Folkestone, Kent, to begin training as an infantry junior leader, before then going on to my battalion and seeing service, operational service. So that was my naive motivation. I naively thought, get the best training possible, come back here and take the fight to the enemy. That's what 16-year-old Glenn thought.
I see. What was the training like, and what was there many other lads from the north in the British Army? I'd have to imagine not many.
Well, the point, the infantry junior leaders battalion was multi-regiment. Their training companies were geared, and so, for example, Arnhem Company was the parachute regiment, and the King's Division, what was the King's Division in the army then. So every cap badge of the army was in the infantry junior leaders battalion, and we were being trained by soldiers who had faced war. So, for example, when I joined, the Falklands conflict was only about 2 years, and not even 2 years, I think maybe about 20 months old. So, for example, my platoon commander in training, my section commander in training, or some of the section commanders in training, were all Falklands veterans. So they would teach you by the book of what you had to know. And then they would say, well, in war, that's a load of bollocks because it just goes out the window and this is what you should do. So that was learning that in training for me, was having veterans like that training me was very, very useful, in their attitude, because for them, it was about field soldiering. It wasn't about being the best person on the parade square who was best presented and drilled. We were very much, as kids at that age, trained that it was about what you did in the field, and about achieving of your best in the field. And I'm often asked, particularly now that I'm a veteran for peace, you know, I can remember being asked that last year to go on to a program to basically ridicule the army, and the fact that it's still recruiting 16-year-olds. Now, I'm totally against the army recruiting 16-year-olds still, but that's more to do with the fact that, having done it, I didn't have a notion, but I cannot fault how the army trained me, if that makes sense. You know, I became a very successful businessman. I've achieved great things post the army, and I can honestly say that I could not have done that but for the tenacity that was taught me in those drilling, by drills I mean learning new skills, months at Shorncliffe. I really, really couldn't. And it was a great way, particularly for me, to widen my worldview. As I said, I had grown up inside the incestuous fishbowl that is the Woodvale community of Belfast, and widen that out to Northern Ireland, where a lot of people think, well, it's all about us. Still do, to be quite honest. Many people think like that. Everything's about Northern Ireland. And to go as a kid at 16, I mean, even the journey, you know, to get in a plane, fly to London, maneuver your way around the tube at that time, you know, get to Waterloo Station, get onto a train then to Folkestone as a wee lad from Belfast. You know, it was big things. And keep in mind that this was in the era in England where you would say, go to a pub and you would see a sign saying, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. You know, and it was daunting, it was challenging. But if I was to rewind the clock back, I would do it all again. I would do, you know, honestly, it was, you know, I often, you know, don't get me wrong, I give the army my best years. The army, you know, I was in the army from 16 to 24. And it was they took my youth. They had my youth. I surrendered my youth. But when I think of all the times post-army, when I was under pressure in business or wherever it may be, you know, because I've set up factories across the world, and where I had to really draw down into my base chakra, you know, it was that schooling that I learned as a young junior leader that always came to the fore, and that gave me the tenacity to see things through. So I can speak, you know, of the army in lots of ways, but I don't regret joining the army.
Fair enough. Okay, so I assume your entire time posted on like active duty was in the north. Yeah. How long after?
No, I wasn't entirely here. No. I was in the regular field army of the, you know, so I did 5 tours here in Northern Ireland. I also saw operational service elsewhere. But my 5 tours here that I did were all what you call Ruinment Battalion tours. By Ruinment Battalion tours, I mean we were here for either on a 4-month or 6-month operational posting. And as your ordinary infantryman, you know, your 4 months of your 6 months was basically day in, day out, 8 hours on, 8 hours QRF, 8 hours off. You know, so 8 hours on, you'd have been out in patrols or wherever it may be, 8 hours QRF, quick reaction force, you're sitting bombed up, ready to deploy to an incident, 8 hours off, get some kit, you know, do your admin, do whatever you need to do. Now, that's not set in stone, and it depended on the actual where the Ruinment Battalion was based. But as a general rule of thumb, that was your basic infantryman's day. You know, I've served 3 of my tours were on the Fermanagh border, as what's known as the Fermanagh Ruinment Battalion. You know, and during those tours, particularly the 1988-89 tour with the 1st Battalion, the Royal Irish Rangers, You know, the IRA hit us hard. They came at us hard. That was the era where they had secured the SAMs. You know, so we arrived at a gable wall that had like a little drawing of a helicopter being taken out by a SAM-7 missile, and sort of like welcome Irish Rangers. And you know, throughout my career in the army over those tours, you know, I've been bombed, I've been mortared, I've been shot at, I've been involved in gun battles with the IRA. There's not much that didn't happen, you know, but I was a professional soldier doing my duty to my notions of Queen and country at that time. And more importantly to my colleagues, because when you're a soldier, you know, once those first rounds start dancing around you, this notion of flag, nationhood, Queen, it's out the window. You know, you're fighting for your buddy to your left and to your right, and that's what it boils down to. And you know, I'm still I still stand by what we did during the conflict years here. I think things could have been much worse, but for the presence of the regular army in Northern Ireland. Certainly would have been much worse for the RUC, who couldn't contain it. And it's, you know, it is what it is. I was in the army from 84 to 92. I then continued government service in another guise to 94. And then I left just before the IRA cessation, first IRA cessation of 94. And I'm, you know, it is what it is. As I say, I surrendered my youth to the army, but in the overall scheme of life, I've no real regrets. And without hindsight, if I was reliving it again, I would probably do it all over again.
I see. You might take me back to what it's actually like to be involved in like a shootout as a soldier. I've heard that in reality it's very disorientating, and you just kind of hear a bullet hitting something or whizzing by you. You kind of don't know where it's coming from and stuff. What's it actually like? I'm sure each one was different, but any that stand out in your mind?
Well, you'll usually depending on the round being fired at you, you will actually feel the round first before the sound, because the round is sometimes traveling faster than the speed of sound, which takes a lot of people to get their heads around. So, for example, you may be looking and seeing a member of your section dancing about as he's avoiding bullets, and you go to, as did happen one day, issue a bollocking to him, and then you suddenly hear the and you realize, oh shit, he's getting shot at, you know. And it's what happens, your discipline takes over, you know. So again, depending on the theater, but you know, all those drills, those very basic, and keep in mind, I was we were infantry, you know, that dash down, crawl to cover, check your sights, return fire. You go into basic robotic mode, and that robotic mode is teaching you to win the firefight. And you win the firefight by locating the enemy and putting rounds into that enemy until they cease to be a threat. It's that simple. And in some theaters, if it gets to it, that may involve fixing bayonets and going for the charge. But in any contact, whether it's in Northern Ireland, whether it's in Bosnia, whether it's in the first Gulf War, whether in later tours of Bosnia or Afghanistan or whatever, those basic drills every time, stick to your drills, stick to what you know, stick to the man to the left and right of you, because that's what it comes down. When it becomes a meat grinder, you are fighting for your friends in your section and in your fire team, and it becomes that becomes your world. Your arcs of fire become your world, and everything going on around you, as a young infantryman, you're oblivious to it. Now, obviously, as you go up the command structure, that changes. You know, so for example, when I would have been a corporal and what you call the signals NCO to a rifle company, you know, I would have been behind the fight slightly, with the company commander, a major, and we would have been more in a command role, where, for example, I may have been calling in artillery or mortar fire to support the troops in the ground and things like that. So as you go up ranks, whether that be in the officer ranks or whether that be in the NCO way, you know, your duties and responsibility change. But in the fight, your fight is within your fire team and your section, and you're fighting to kill them and put them down. And you do that in the ways that you're taught. They're a target. They're not a human. They are completely dehumanized. They're the enemy. They're the terrorist, whatever you want to call them, all the multitude of things. And your job is to put rounds into them, aimed rounds, until they cease to be a threat to you and your comrades.
How did you view the like, we'll say, the military or operational competency of the IRA, like their ability to plan operations well, to actually have a shootout with ye, like proper trained soldiers? How far below ye in terms of like military warfare skills did you consider them?
Like the IRA is an underground, or was an underground, guerrilla army. So to compare the IRA and its tactics to the likes of ourselves, who were a national standing army, it's not apples for apples. I'm not going to go there. The IRA of its day, and certainly of the period that I would have been involved in them, was considered, not just by us but by others, as the best trained, the most effective guerrilla army in the world. You know, that's not Glenn Bradley saying that. That is what is deemed historically of who and what they are. In the operations that I dealt against them, again, it depended on where I was serving and where and what was happening. So, for example, when I was Armagh Roma Battalion, South Armagh, like South Armagh gets a fierce reputation as being the fighters, but to me, certainly back then, South Armagh was criminal. It was all about smuggling. It was all about criminality. One of the cushiest tours, for want of a better description, I had was in South Armagh, because the IRA there was too focused on lining its pockets. Strut across the peninsula there of Monaghan into Fermanagh, they were formidable. They were a formidable underground guerrilla army, using terror tactics, don't get me wrong, using guerrilla tactics, but no, they were different. So it depended where you were, and that would be the story of the history of my life. You know, if you think, again, going back to where I grew up, the IRA, to me, that was engaging in my area was sectarian, because they were trying to kill, they were killing ordinary innocent civilians and Protestants. But, you know, you maybe travel 2 miles up the Falls Road into Lenadown, the IRA up there were having full-scale gun battles with the British Army on the street. So it depended on the unit. It depended on who was commanding the unit of the IRA. Same for all paramilitaries. But the IRA that I fought against is and was considered the most effective guerrilla underground movement of its time. And who am I to disagree with such historians?
I see. Actually, on that note, did you ever, as a British armament, did you ever clash with the various loyalist groups? Was there any shootouts you had with them or operations against them?
No, because most of the tours that I did, as I said, were Roman battalion tours, so it didn't place me in an area where I would have been in confrontation with loyalists. The only time that contradicts is in, I think it was early 86, January 86. Often whenever a battalion is under strength, it will ask for volunteers from other units. So in January 86, I found myself back in Belfast for 2 weeks during the protests against the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And I found myself up on the Shankill Road, which, you know, I'm from the Woodvale Road. The Shankill runs onto the Woodvale. with my Aquilin shield and we called it the motorbike helmet because it looked like a motorbike helmet, facing loyalist crowds in a riot situation. But that was the only real time where I was in a operational role against what could be perceived as people from my own community. The rest of the time were all room and battalion tours that largely pitted me into generally majority Republican nationalist communities where the IRA had a foothold and a stronghold.
Okay, we went through it a little bit, but the other soldiers that comprised the army that you were part of, obviously you're from the area, so you'd have a pretty good understanding of it. Like if you can gauge like how well of a grasp of the actual history and understanding and the groups involved that these other British soldiers had, like if you would ask them to write like a paragraph on what is it going on here and why are you as a British soldier needed here, what do you think they come up with?
Bollocks, put it mildly.